Mr. Ulyanov, thank you for joining us once again to discuss important geopolitical issues. I would like to start with the recent statements by NATO Secretary-General Stoltenberg, who said that the countries of the alliance are ready to deploy more nuclear weapons on standby. What does that mean? How would you comment on this?
I think this is a typical example of escalating nuclear rhetoric. It is a very unfortunate example. The NATO Secretary-General has a very tangential relationship with nuclear weapons, which belong to the United States, Britain and France, which generally consider their nuclear arsenals to be separate. Lately, as the end of his term in office draws nearer, Stoltenberg has been making bizarre statements, and in this case, the U.S. essentially had to disavow his words. White House officials said that the U.S. is quite satisfied with the current status of its nuclear arsenals, and Washington has no plans to change anything.
Do you think they are ready to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia, as they claim? How can they talk about it when they must realize the immediate consequences of such a move?
These are the times we live in, when people do not think much about the consequences. Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas is now likely to take Josep Borrell's place. She too said last week that Russia must be defeated to prevent World War III, so their heads are in a very special place. I think they're very disturbed by the major changes in the international arena. International relations may not be moving away from Western and American hegemony so quickly, but they are moving steadily and surely toward a multipolar world. This worries them a lot, and they see our country as the locomotive of this process, and are trying their best to prevent a negative scenario for them as much as possible. Hence such statements.
And under what conditions can Russia really use tactical nuclear weapons? We all hear that if they go any further, something will definitely have to be done. But the West keeps inflaming the situation.
The Russian nuclear doctrine contains the answer to your question. Both tactically and strategically, we are ready. We can, theoretically, use any nuclear weapons in two cases. If weapons of mass destruction are used against us, and if Russian statehood itself is threatened. There is nothing like that at the moment, so I think that the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine within the framework of our nuclear doctrine can be ruled out completely. Another thing is that, as our president has pointed out several times, the nuclear doctrine is a living document. It can change, and in all probability, it will change. We will know in which direction when the relevant decisions are made.
What is it like to work in Western countries now? How has everything that is happening now affected diplomacy?
I don't think what's happening has had much impact on the centers of multilateral diplomacy, which are New York, Geneva, and Vienna. Of course, some things have changed, but these changes are not as big and dramatic as they could be, as is sometimes the case with Russian bilateral foreign missions in some countries, which are working under very difficult conditions. We still have a normal process in many respects, similar to what we had before the special military operation, before the pandemic. Of course, there have been some changes, but in general, we cannot complain. It seems to me, and I hope I'm not deluding myself, that we are more or less in control of the situation. I repeat, we are working hard. As before, Russia plays a very prominent role in the activities of the international organizations in Vienna, and everyone recognizes this. So it has become a bit more difficult, but we are managing it.
I think that the audience will be interested in such understanding a little bit what has changed and how. You say some things have changed a little bit. In what way?
The most striking example of this is that meetings of specialized bodies, such as the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, the International Atomic Energy Agency, meetings of the Governing Council, and others, usually begin with Western statements of a political nature, statements that have nothing to do with the mandate of the bodies in which these statements are made. Of course, we have the right to respond, and we have rather intense, heated discussions. But strictly speaking, our work and the work of the Western countries is not about this. Such political discussions are more appropriate at the UN General Assembly, perhaps the UN Security Council. But this happens, I repeat, within those bodies which, by definition, should not get involved in big politics.
I'm curious about your opinion about what some in the Western press are calling the terrifying stealth submarine, referring to the recently launched Russian nuclear submarine Arkhangelsk. How do you think the demonstration of Russian military or navy power influences the West?
Well, I don't know how much effect it can have, but the fact that such a demonstration is useful and necessary is absolutely certain. We need to remind them that we are not playing silly games. This is a very serious situation. The West is entering into a confrontation with the largest nuclear power, and it is probably a good idea for them to remember that. That is, demonstrations are useful, but it is important, of course, to plan them very carefully and to conduct them in such a way that they do not escalate uncontrollably. So far, I think we have been quite successful in doing that.
Yes, because in the West it is often interpreted as Russia is preparing an attack.
But this is their worldview, and we should also bear in mind that, of course, we are dealing with information warfare, in which all means are good, in their opinion.
Yes, let's move on to this notorious Ukraine Peace Summit, where the issue of nuclear security was discussed. What do you think of this event, to which, of course, Russia was not invited?
I would give it an F, a solid F, that is, farce. Discussing issues of peace without the participation of one of the two parties to the conflict is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. It is a PR stunt, completely pointless, or rather harmful. And that is how the international community saw it. As far as I remember, invitations were sent out to 168 countries. Out of those, 92 delegations actually showed up, many of them far from the highest level. The joint communiqué, released at the end of the Burgenstock meeting, was only signed by 80 countries. 12 of the most influential countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America refused to sign the document, and the day after the summit ended, Iraq and Jordan withdrew their support, with Rwanda following suit a couple days later. That gives us a total of, what, 77? If you read the joint statements in the joint communiqué, it is hard to hold back tears. The whole thing was not worth bothering so many delegations for. It is a trivial document of very little political significance. As for the discussion of nuclear issues at this meeting, these discussions in the document itself, the relevant section of it, are very banal indeed. No revelations there. Tellingly, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi refused to attend the event. He explained his decision in an interview with Ukrainian mass media, saying that the IAEA performs very serious technical tasks and stays away from political matters, far from the agency's mandate. I think this is the right position.
I was just about to discuss the situation at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which is a hot topic right now, of course. Where is Russia's cooperation with IAEA, in particular with Director Grossi, whom you just mentioned?
You know, our relationship with Mr. Grossi looks quite constructive and businesslike to me. Of course, our opinions, assessments, and approaches do differ from time to time, which is normal. Anyway, Grossi believes that the agency should maintain relations with both Ukraine and Russia, especially with Russia, which is a major nuclear power, a country with a powerful nuclear energy industry, and a country that builds numerous power plants abroad. We communicate regularly. Mr. Grossi has regular meetings with Alexei Likhachov, the head of Rosatom. Besides, Mr. Grossi has met twice with the President of Russia. The last meeting took place on March 6th in Sochi. In other words, I think our working relationship is very good. This, however, does not mean that we have no disagreements on certain issues. This, I repeat, is absolutely normal. The main thing is that both we and Mr. Grossi have a spirit of business cooperation. And, in my opinion, it is working out, in general.
Do these disagreements cause any problem? Do they affect our cooperation in any way?
Well, of course they do. For example, we are not satisfied with the way Mr. Grossi's regular reports on nuclear safety in Ukraine are prepared. They describe the situation at the Zaporozhye nuclear power power plant, and the facts laid forth in these reports and the assessments in them sometimes leave much to be desired. But recently, including thanks to our ongoing work, certain misrepresentations have been gradually corrected, and the reports are becoming more honest and objective, so I do not see anything really dramatic in this regard.
There has been a lot of discussion recently about the possibility of relaunching the Zaporozhye power plant. What are the chances?
That is a good question, thank you. The thing is that I'm not quite sure why, but there have been some strange allegations in the Western press. Allegedly, the Russian Federation decided to bring the reactors back online. We never had such an intention. In fact, this is disinformation. The issue was discussed between Mr. Grossi and me for the last time on May 28th in Kaliningrad, where the Director General met with a Russian intergroup delegation. As the outcome of that discussion, both sides confirmed publicly, in front of the press, the common opinion that it would be premature to restart Zaporozhye nuclear power plant reactors now. It would be too dangerous, given that Ukraine never stopped attacking the power plant. If operating nuclear reactors get damaged as a result of such strikes, the consequences could be terrible. So we're not going to rush the relaunch of the power plant.
At the same time, we also see Ukraine trying to deprive Russia of its membership on the Board of Governors in the International Atomic Energy Agency. Why did they try to do that?
It seems to me that Ukraine has largely lost its expertise, and from time to time it takes some exotic steps that are either unfeasible or completely unjustified. We see this in a number of international organizations, including the IAEA Board of Governors. The Ukrainians began to promote the idea that Russia, as a so-called aggressor, occupier, the country that seized the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, cannot have a seat on the Board of Governors. What they were saying goes against the IAEA statute, according to which a dozen countries are not elected, but appointed to the Board of Governors on a permanent basis every year. And the only criteria for appointing a country there is that a country's level of nuclear energy development is sufficient. Russia is among the leaders in this regard, which is why it has been on the Board of Governors ever since the IAEA was founded. What's interesting is that Kiev's poorly thought-out position was strongly opposed by all members of the Board of Governors, all the 34 countries other than Ukraine, including Western countries like the US. Western countries have made it clear that if Ukraine keeps pushing the issue or brings it to a vote, then the Western countries themselves will vote in favor of Russia. But not until then did the Ukrainians back down. They had an excellent chance of getting themselves into a very stupid situation, thanks to their stubbornness, lack of common sense, and necessary expertise.
So it looks like Ukraine and Zelensky sometimes do things without running them by Washington first.
Oh, we'd better ask Washington and Kiev about that. They probably do coordinate most things, but there are situations when the tail starts to wag the dog, to use a slang expression. I don't know what they were counting on. I repeat, it was a very poorly thought-out initiative that was doomed to fail. But apparently, Kiev's level of understanding of the current situation is not sufficient to make reasonable conclusions. They almost pushed themselves into a trap there. Imagine if all the 34 member countries of the Governing Council, except Ukraine, had voted in favor of Russia against the Ukrainian approach. It would have been an embarrassment of epic proportions, and the Ukrainians had almost created it themselves.
That's right. Another hot issue on the nuclear energy agenda is, of course, Iran and its nuclear program, and the fact that the IAEA recently adopted an anti-Iranian resolution. Can you talk to us a little bit more about this? Why did the IAEA choose to go this way?
Well, I can tell you that the Board of Governors is composed in such a way that, by sheer arithmetic, the majority belongs to the Western countries, and all Western countries take orders from Washington, Paris, London, and Berlin. Once the order is given, they follow it without thinking much about the consequences. This is just the way it is. In this case, the three major European powers, Germany, France, and the UK, for some reason decided that it was necessary to send a strong message to Tehran, and the timing was really bad. The country barely finished mourning the deaths of their president and foreign minister, so the vote didn't go as planned. It's true that the resolution was adopted by 20 votes, but during a previous vote in November 2022, 26 nations voted in favor of the resolution, as opposed to only 20 this time. Also in 2022, 5 nations abstained, while this year a total of 12 countries did. Russia and China voted against the resolution both times. Why? Because the resolution is meaningless. This is a typical example of megaphone diplomacy, not real diplomacy. And this resolution dealt a serious blow to the relationship between the IAEA and Iran by the sheer fact of being there, even regardless of its content. Our approach is completely different. We are betting on real diplomacy. This is a more promising track to follow. But we have failed to prevent the resolution from being adopted. And Iran has already responded to this resolution by taking a number of steps to ramp up its peaceful nuclear program. If this is what the European powers wanted, then we can congratulate them on their success.
And how can this disagreement between the IAEA and Iran still be resolved? Or as long as the West insists on not talking to Iran, roughly speaking, everything will continue in the same vein?
Well, it's really hard to call their relationship with Iran a dialogue. It's more of an attempt to dictate the West's will. And Iran is a country that does not respond well to diktat. Therefore, this line of action is doomed to end up in failure. The Vienna talks on the nuclear deal went on for almost a year, from April 2021 to March 2022. I was the head of the Russian delegation. And you know, it was a tough negotiation. But by March 2022, the deal was almost completely ready. It's hard to say exactly, but I believe it was like 95% or even 98% ready. We were in the home stretch when the negotiations were broken off. Then, by the fall of 2022, it became clear that this was a conscious decision made by the European powers and the US. In the meantime, Iran, China, and Russia were and remain ready to continue talks, and if the negotiation process is ever resumed, once there is political will to do so, there is still every opportunity to restore the nuclear deal to everyone's satisfaction. By the way, if this were to happen, then all of these claims, almost all of the claims made by the West against Iran, would be cleared in a matter of months, all of them. So, in fact, the West's position is hypocritical and has no leg to stand on. The powers of the West, on the one hand, are driving a wedge between the IAEA and Iran. Yet, on the other hand, they're accusing Iran of all mortal sins, despite the fact that Iran is ready to settle all issues through negotiations. Iran will be willing to return to the original parameters of the nuclear deal as long as the USA withdraws its illegitimate sanctions. And we almost got there, but the negotiations was wrecked at the last moment. In principle, the entire responsibility for that lies with Western countries, and the most dangerous consequence of this is that the resulting uncertainty is fraught with uncontrolled escalation. We have a very explosive situation on our hands now.
Again, why is that? What's in it for the West? If they can get what they want from Iran, and they know it, and you just said it was pretty much of 90% done deal, almost everything was ready. So why not go for it?
I think there are two reasons. The first is the ideology underlying this approach, some very strong ideology, and that is pretty obvious. And secondly, there are big problems with the level of professionalism. The level of professionalism has significantly decreased over the last 10 to 15 years compared to what we saw, let's say, at the beginning of the century or in the late 20th century. And that is really a tragedy. It makes sense for all the involved parties to approach negotiations from a rational position. Yet, in the case of the Iranian nuclear program, the position of the West is in many aspects irrational. In fact, by launching a massive campaign against Iran, the US pushed Iran to step up its nuclear program, well ahead of its own plans. The responsibility lies entirely with Washington. They did it on their own. It is a completely absurd situation, but that is the reality.
It's been 6 years since the US withdrew from the nuclear deal with Iran. What else has changed? Is the US any closer or further away from resolving these issues between America and Iran?
You know, I don't think the Biden administration has much to boast about in terms of international policy. They don't have any major achievements, but this nuclear deal was at least one particular area where the Americans had a chance to make a positive breakthrough. Under Biden, they began negotiating the nuclear deal, and they were quite actively involved in those negotiations. And I would say that the Americans played a rather constructive role at first. They are tough negotiators, just as the Iranians are tough negotiators too, but they were able to make progress together. But then the decision was made. I don't know whether it was for political reasons, whether it was because some strong objections from the Republican Party. I don't know what happened there, because for a while there was hope that the negotiations would resume after the midterm Congress elections in the US in November 2022. But no, they didn't. And in response to a reporter's question whether the nuclear deal was dead, Biden said yes. It seems to me that this is a strategic miscalculation on the part of the United States. They have no backup plan. They have created a situation of uncertainty in terms of both regional security in the Gulf area and international security. It is a serious strategic miscalculation. The same can be said about Europe. At one point, Europe distanced itself from Trump and his policies, yet it has ended up being in the same boat with the Americans at the current stage.
It has. And finally, let's talk about Russia's so-called isolation. There is a narrative in the West that Vladimir Putin and Russia are isolated because no one wants anything to do with them. So what are the people actually saying about that in Europe? Do they believe that Russia is truly isolated?
You know, many people do actually believe this, though I'm not sure how many in the diplomatic corps think this way. But if we take the general public, who are far removed from day-to-day international affairs, then quite a few of them believe this narrative. It is an issue of mentality. They seem to think that the Western world is the whole planet, but in reality, Western countries only account for about 12% of the world's population, which is not that much, really. Here in Vienna, there are about 50 countries that have a strong anti-Russian position, and sometimes they muster up to 60 votes, but no more than that. The rest of the world has very little desire to participate in these anti-Russian campaigns. Many countries distance themselves from such a course, which is also reflected in the vote. Many countries abstain, and in the current context, abstaining is almost like voting against an anti-Russian decision. Another indicator is that we regularly and successfully put forward various initiatives that receive broad support, especially in areas such as drug control. Our approach to this issue has been supported by more than 40 countries.
Could you elaborate a bit? I'm curious about what Russia has to offer in terms of drug control that those countries like.
The things we propose are quite elementary, really. It's clear that you need a balanced approach to successfully fight drugs. First, you need the efforts of law enforcement agencies. That is the essential aspect, without which nothing will work. Second, you have to take care of human rights. The rights of drug addicts are an important aspect, though not the main one. And finally, well-organized medical treatment is crucial. This is the kind of comprehensive approach that we advocate. In the West, the law enforcement aspect is often completely overlooked, and they believe that the problem can be solved by dealing with human rights alone, including providing drug addicts with drugs, substantial therapy, syringes, so that they don't pick them up on the street, but get packaged, disinfected syringes to inject themselves. This is their way of looking at things, which obviously has had far-reaching consequences. Now, Western countries, one after another, maybe a dozen of them so far, are actually violating the legally binding UN drug conventions and legalizing cannabis and marijuana. This is a direct violation of legal obligations. And in Canada, they have gone even further. In British Columbia, they're starting to legalize harder drugs.
Why are they doing this, I wonder? Don't they see that they're heading into a dead end?
They say they're fighting the black market, moving the drug trade from the black market to the gray or even white market to get additional taxes. I think it is a perverted view of the world, but it is what is happening. Even the human rights aspect has become a striking example lately. They've started talking about the need to protect the rights of drug dealers and drug producers. That is rock bottom. It doesn't get any worse than that. They've put the slogan of harm reduction at the forefront. They have already given up, believing that the harm from drugs is inevitable, and there is no need to fight it much, only to reduce the harm a little. We and many other countries have a different view, that the task is to prevent harm in the first place. And we see our goal, our ambitious mission, as building a drug-free society. Of course, it's hard to do that in real life, but if we're going to set goals, then we should set them high. But they have already raised the white flag in advance and are only fighting to make the harm a little less. So we have more than 40 countries under our banner, and it turns out that we have to do this. It's difficult for any other country that shares our approach to lead such a movement, and they trust us. Recently, for example, we initiated the adoption of a strong statement on combating Islamophobia, which was co-sponsored by 34 Islamic countries. Can this be called isolation? Of course not. This assertion is very far from the truth. There is no isolation, but there are certain difficulties in relations, mainly with Western countries.
We keep talking about multipolarity. Do your colleagues in Europe see it? Do they believe it? That the world is already changing and the dynamics of building relationships between different countries are different now? Or do they think it's some kind of fairy tale that the Kremlin is telling? While in reality, as we said, they're isolated and no one wants to deal with the Russians.
To be honest, I don't think we even discussed this issue with other delegations. Our agenda is a very practical one. There are specialized international organizations, all kinds of commissions and committees, and we prefer to deal with issues that fall within their purview. As to what they think in the West, I think there are different people in the West. Some are able to assess the situation more accurately. In my opinion, the trend towards dismantling the American hegemony is obvious. We see manifestations of this trend at every step. Of course, there's not a single event. There are processes that are spread out over time, but the trend is quite obvious. And it is quite obvious that new centers of power are appearing on the world map. Russia is represented in many of them, such as BRICS, the SCO, and other groups. There seems to be no arguing against this. But the most important thing is that the reaction of the Western countries to what is happening, which is sometimes hysterical, and their behavior towards the Russian Federation can be explained, it seems to me, precisely by the fact that deep down, the Western countries understand that we are entering a different era where international relations will have to be conducted differently than, say, in the second half of the 20th century.
It's good that they understand. Now it's for them to accept it as a reality.
Life itself will force them to do this.
Thank you very much. That was Mikhail Ulyanov, permanent representative of the Russian Federation to international organizations in Vienna. As always, it's very interesting to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you.